The Patriot's Promise. Copyright 2015 by Glisam Language Arts Solutions.
It might be nice to include an article about Blanchard Park in our spring edition, Mrs. Wright announced at the monthly staff meeting of the school newspaper. Tony's hand shot up. "I'll do it." Mrs. Wright's eyes narrowed as she looked at him suspiciously. Tony wasn't exactly the type of teenager who would be interested in flora and fauna. She suspected ulterior motives. "Don't you think you're being a bit impetuous, Tony? I haven't told you about the other stories," Mrs. Wright responded cautiously. "We need someone to interview the new soccer coach, someone to report on the new low-fat lunch menu, and someone to report about college scholarships." None of these topics could sway Tony from his first choice. He was a bright young man who knew what he liked, and healthy food was not it. He jokingly quoted an Emerson aphorism. "Hey, Mrs. Wright, you know what old Ralph always said. The happiest man is he who learns from nature the lesson of worship." Mrs. Wright's old wrinkled eyes filled with fury, and her mouth spewed out a reply. "And the unhappiest student is the one who piques his teacher." If there was a way to get into trouble, Tony would stumble upon it. Mrs. Wright took a deep breath. In a slow, determined voice, she laid out the rules. "Mr. Amara, if I give you this assignment, I expect it to be completely secular. You are to write only about plants and animals in the park, nothing else. This is a public high school newspaper. I don't want controversy. I don't want to be called into the principal's office. I don't want phone calls from angry parents. I want to keep my job. Do you understand?" He didn't, but he sensed that his teacher was too angry to explain. Tony nodded his head cautiously in agreement and took Mrs. Wright's chastisement in stride. Then he waited patiently for her decision. Since no other students appeared interested in the assignment, Mrs. Wright reluctantly handed it over to him. Tony smiled brightly. He reveled at the thought of starting his assignment and knew exactly where he would begin, at the old abandoned house near the entrance to Blanchard Park. He had walked past it many times, hoping to discover if the rumors were true or only some fantasy born from the minds of creative teenagers. Whatever he discovered, Tony knew one thing for sure. He would not let his creativity or freedom of speech become fettered by Mrs. Wright. After the meeting, Tony hurried out of the classroom. His girlfriend, Kayla, followed after him, stepping on Tony's shadow. She called after him, but he did not stop until she reached out and grabbed the back of his shirt. "Stop!" she shouted. "I know what you're up to. Mrs. Wright said flowers and fauna, nothing else." Tony laughed. "That includes wildlife. And in case you forgot, humans can be wild animals sometimes." Kayla threw her hands up in frustration. "You're totally deranged if you think you're going anywhere near that house. It's surrounded with crime tape." Tony refused to listen to her warnings. Although he was well aware of the stories surrounding the house, he was adamant about learning the truth. Some said the yellow tape had been put up because the old house's collapse was imminent. Others whispered that an elderly madman lived there. Rumor had it that the home was impregnable because the man had strapped a dirty bomb to himself and threatened to blow it up if anyone dared come near. All the stories were like the siren songs calling to Tony. The next morning, there were few signs of spring when Kayla and Tony went to Blanchard Park. It was the middle of March and no flowers were blooming. No leaves were bursting from buds on the trees. The woods and pastures were stark. It didn't matter. Tony had come to see the house. It loomed in the distance. A tattered American flag was hanging on the porch in front of the door. Tony grabbed his camera, zoomed in, set the aperture, and snapped a picture. He took a deep breath and said, "Let's go." Kayla wrapped her arm around Tony's and pulled herself close to him as they approached the red brick house. They ducked under the tape and stepped cautiously up the front porch. Wooden boards bent and creaked. "Stop there, or I'll shoot," a shaky voice shouted from inside. "That ribbon says do not cross. You're trespassing, and I don't like your impertinence." Kayla tried to pull away and run, but Tony would not release her from his grip, fearing that any sudden movements might trigger a flurry of gunfire. Tony mustered up his courage and calmly explained why he had come to visit, begging the old man for an interview. Silence suffocated the air for several minutes. Then, slowly, the front door opened. Kayla and Tony stepped inside. Steely gray eyes looked up from a ghostly wrinkled face. A long, crooked finger was wrapped around the trigger of an old Civil War rifle. "My name's Adams, Jonas Adams," the man announced. "What paper did you say you write for?" Kayla and Tony were too startled to answer. Jonas laughed. "What's the matter? You never saw someone this old before?" This question, too, was left unanswered. Jonas sighed. "I guess not. Most people kill themselves long before they reach my age." As Jonas spoke, his eyes became transfixed on an invisible image trapped in a time warp. They rested there a moment before coming to life again. Jonas cackled. "Well, today I'm not exercising my right to die. I'm exercising my right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." "Well, sir, I'm happy to hear that," Tony nervously replied. Convinced that the teen's curiosity was sincere, Jonas motioned them to sit down. Kayla and Tony pulled up 2 chairs as Jonas put down his rifle. The old man explained that he was a patriot. "I love my country and everything it represented. Freedom, equality, opportunity." Jonas paused a moment to study the teen's reaction to his comments. "So what's wrong?" Tony asked, raising his hands and shrugging his shoulders. "No one cares anymore. Everybody's distracted, spending time on nonsense and no time on important matters," Jonas explained. "Their thinking is clouded and their philosophies are twisted." "Philosophy?" Tony asked. "What's that?" Jonas's eyes widened. "Your beliefs about life and how to live it. Don't they teach philosophy in school anymore? You know, objectivism, existentialism, transcendentalism, atomism, to name a few." "Transcend. That one sounds familiar. I remember our teacher telling us about Emerson and Thoreau going insane and running away into the woods. Sorry. Are you a transcender?" "Transcendentalist," Jonas corrected him. "No, but I like to think, and I don't like people telling me what to think." Tony and Kayla didn't know what to think of Jonas. Tony looked around the room. He noticed a dusty bookcase across the room. It was filled with leather-bound books with titles he had never seen before. The Torah, the Quran, the King James Bible, the Upanishads, the Tibetan Book of the Dead, Human Destiny, and many more. Upon closer inspection, he saw a few books he had heard of, The Origin of Species and A Brief History of Time. "Let me tell you about those, boy," Jonas volunteered. "Many years ago, people had access to all types of books. Wise, objective people read and formed their own opinions." Tony liked the sound of that. Like any good reporter, he wanted to know more. "So what conclusions have you formed?" "I think the powers that be are trying to play with our minds. For instance, a long time ago, humanity understood its place in the universe.
All life was precious. Somewhere along the way, people started putting contingencies on life. Life was only precious if it belonged to a healthy, intelligent creature. All other life was disposable. Jonas told the teens a poignant story about his parents. He had loved and cared for them in their old age. He described how he comforted their frail bodies and treasured every moment that he had with them. They had become wise in their old age, and he valued their wisdom. A thought jumped into Jonas's mind. The sadness in his eyes was replaced by sparks of fire. When that right to die law was passed, I lost my temper. What's this world coming to? I promised myself that I would never relinquish my life voluntarily. God gave me life, and only God has the right to take it away.
Zeus? Kayla asked, her brows furrowed in confusion.
Oh, for God's sake, Jonas grumbled.
Again, Jonas sighed, this time in despair.
Yeah, I suppose they haven't taught you about God either.
Of course they have. We've studied all kinds of gods, Greek, Roman. We even studied origin myths. Jonas furrowed his brow a moment until he had an epiphany.
The Constitution. Surely you've heard about the American Constitution and unalienable rights.
He went on to explain that many years ago he had visited his doctor because his health was declining. His joints ached, his hands shook uncontrollably, and his balance was unsteady.
You know what that bloody doctor did?
Before Tony could answer, Jonas's rant continued.
He told me it could help me die. Of course, it was illegal back then, but that didn't stop him.
Jonas shared the details. The doctor had told him that death would be a way for him to escape the pain that his old body inflicted on him daily. One simple, painless injection could put him into a peaceful, permanent sleep. Jonas refused. Instead, he found a reason to live. People needed to know how society functioned in the days before human emotions became inhumane. He promised himself to share stories of the old days to any youngster who would listen to him. He foolishly thought he could use the media to his advantage. The media twisted the story by describing Jonas as a crazy old man. Soon, there was an influx of teenagers traveling to the park, but none were wise enough to listen. They came to gawk at Jonas. They came to harm him. There was no cessation of the flood of troublemakers. He had to take matters into his own hands. Tony had been listening to Jonas's story with undivided interest, but then his eyes spotted it. A massive bomb sitting on the floor in the corner. So it was true. An explosion of heartbeats pounded against his chest, but he managed to continue to ask questions, trying hard to remain objective. Why would our teachers keep information from us? It doesn't make sense. Jonas smirked.
You seem like a smart boy. I think you'll figure it out. Just don't get full of yourself. No human is perfect, and we need to accept our imperfections. You have to be kind to all people and respect all people. You have to learn to recognize the difference between the truth and a lie. I'd like to tell you a parable.
That's a word I've heard before. A story with a moral lesson, right? I read one once when I was a freshman, but they're not on our reading list now. Too banal. They said we needed stories that were more relevant and exciting. Jonas was disappointed with Tony's credulity. He hoped he would be willing to listen to one more story.
Did you ever hear the tale of the men who thought they knew everything?
Jonas asked. Tony and Kayla shook their heads. Jonas told them a story about a group of the world's most brilliant men who had joined together to design a program that would make the world perfect for humanity. They worked long and hard using supercomputers and amazing software. They considered all possibilities and fine-tuned their calculations. For a time, all went well, but slowly one small microorganism's mutation went unnoticed.
Small as it was, it had the power to influence the life of every living thing on the planet. Ultimately, life ceased. Sadly, no one lived to learn that the human brain is incapable of knowing the universe in its entirety, and no computer makes perfect predictions. That margin of error can kill you. Silence filled the room. Tony and Kayla were hoping for a happy ending. Finally, Tony spoke. So what do we do? You live your life. Live it fully every day. Do anything you can to make the world a better place for all people. Be optimistic. Try to find solutions to impossible problems. Keep your mind open to all possibilities, including the possibility of failure. But you didn't. You're sitting here with a bomb. Tony's heart beat fast and hard, but it was too late to take back his words. Jonas laughed again. You think I'm a pessimist? I waited for you, and you came. I didn't kill myself. I defended myself. Now the most important question is, will you help me? Help him. Much of what Jonas had said made sense, and much was beyond Tony's comprehension. Minutes passed. Finally, Tony promised to try. The teens shook Jonas's hand and turned to leave. As they stepped onto the front porch, Jonas winked and said, Oh, by the way, the bomb is fake, but don't tell anyone. Tony and Kayla laughed. They had learned much and were eager to learn more. Tony would write his story about the plants and animals of the park. Jonas's story would be told, even if Mrs. Wright refused to publish it.